All right.
So, welcome to, I guess, I want to make this, before I open up, I want to, I guess, I don't want to treat this like a typical lecture. I want to, if you're kind of stuck on something, if there's an idea that I'm not explaining well, interrupt me, by all means, please just interrupt me. This thing's going to be divided into three things. I'm going to go over, obviously, the book is set into part one, part two, but there's really three things here. I like to believe that there's three parts here. I agree with the first part, where it's one, we kind of set the stage, right? Las Vegas and this mode of building had not been taken seriously by academics for many years. As Las Vegas is kind of developing as a city, and it needed a way to be kind of categorized, and it needed a way to be kind of analyzed and critical, or I guess in a highbrow manner, right? We needed to kind of elevate its status from an academic kind of standpoint. And what they were doing in part one was really kind of introducing all these kind of things, right? Like physiognomy, all these kind of big words, right? Like all these things, right? Like attributes that relate to something else, and all these other kind of things. To set the stage for part two, which I think is actually kind of short, really good, right? Set the stage for where they were currently at, in the way that they kind of saw the world, which was the comparison with the decorated shed and a duck, right? What they were kind of talking about was that ducks, for the longest time, have been the way that architects have done things. And sheds tend to be the more economical, the more kind of everyday of construction, the way of kind of how things kind of happen. And there seems to be this kind of disconnect between decorated sheds and ducks and what architects in the profession and in academia think is worthwhile to analyze and bring it to the highbrow status, right? Like there's this kind of like segregation of like everyday, boring, ordinary shed, which they kind of detract from, right? And then there's the ducks, things that very have clear cultural images, meaning, and those can also have lowbrow connotations, right? Just like the very much the duck stand, and then the highbrow to where you have brutalism, which is like Corbusier's later work in Louis Kahn. But they both operate in the same way. Part three is really kind of the speculation. Part three is where we see, okay, if we operate on the duck and shed idea, what does it mean for us as a society, and how does it show, as an architectural profession in society, in what we value and where we're putting our intellect and capital towards, and what does that mean morally for us as architects, right? And what does that mean when we construct cities, mega structures, and when we construct cities that happen slowly and gradually over time? What does that mean for maybe in terms of class? I'm speaking monetarily, and what does it mean socially? And how do they create segregation amongst each other? Just on the simple approach on the way that we see the world and the way that we design buildings in these regards, in terms of the duck and the decorated shed. Some of their critiques get pretty brutal against the establishment. And they become very, very kind of obvious, right? So it begins to bring that stance where lots of sheds begin to become part of the academic world. There's things that can be discussed now, right? Like design build, all these kind of things that hadn't existed in academia for so long. Some begin to exist again. Like this really didn't happen until the Beaux-Arts period, right? Where the architect was exclusively trained to do banks, museums, opera houses, all these other kind of big highbrow establishments. They were no longer being trained to do power plants, no longer trained to do the convenience store, the gas station, the liquor store. These things that we kind of think about, even everyday homes, right? The low-income homes, the medium, even the lower income class. There was a really big attachment that came from the Beaux-Arts period and how architects are trained. If you think about how pervasive that thought has been, you'll see people like Zaha Hadid, Patrick Schumacher, that will say that, yes, I agree. There's the sheds, haven't figured out. There's no beauty in them. Architects should speculate on the things that engineers have not figured out yet, right? An engineer can now basically stamp a gas station, even a contractor can stamp several smaller low-income homes with an architect's license. So why do we even need to think about it? Why do we need to reevaluate this as architects, right? Venturi and Izenour and Scott Brown flipped that whole thought and introduced postmodernism into this whole thing. So that's really kind of the bigger picture. So now I'm going to jump a little bit more into the detail. So so like they set the stage in thinking about how do I go? Okay. Right, they set the stage with the Villa Reduce, right? This is one of many new urban planning principles, right? That we follow a grid. The grid gets subdivided, based off the Jeffersonian grid. Everyone has a piece in it, right? How it happens. Everyone, as long as you follow the grid establishes how you kind of work, right? And there's a lot of architects that really kind of took this idea, this urban planning principle, to like the logical extremes, such as Richard Meyer, Gwathmey, etc. These urban planning principles, right? That came from that time period, that reestablished a lot of the Jeffersonian grid ideas. Frank Lloyd Wright was very much that on the same idea, right? Broadacre City, right? You divide land by 1 mile, subdivide it into half-mile quadrants. Some become residential, right? Then you end up with a quadruple block plan, where you give everyone half an acre, and and everyone gets their own plot of land, and you get homes, residences, happening on one side. The main transportation occurs on the first floor. Second floor is where a lot of the social civic events kind of happen, right? Like this is kind of where these ideas occur for Frank Lloyd Wright, right? Like helicopters didn't exist around this time, so he speculated that people were going to move that way. He didn't yet know what the future of the automobile was going to be like when he was drawing this. And then there was also what is this? This is Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, where there's a central court, right? A central portion of the city where all the kind of day-to-day stuff kind of happens. And then there's all these other kind of substations that are all connected that generate basically neighborhoods, right? This is kind of how you see cities really kind of develop, right? You've got the center, and you've got rings kind of occurring around it. So if you're kind of familiar, this idea really kind of became pervasive around with freeways and ways of circulation. They came off this planning. So they're saying, right? Like they're just saying, right? Like all this kind of exists, and this is the current way that we see things. But is there another way, right? Where they see that there's also the house minimization, how you treat dense areas, right? You cut out all the you cut out larger chunks of the city, right? With house minimization, and how you develop this as an urban plan. And there wasn't acting, and this is one of the things that they talked about, right? this would be a perfect sign, right? The Arc de Triomphe is a sign. And it happens with obelisks and all these kind of things that are kind of looking at it, right? So they said, what current mode of thinking can we use? We see that we have, we're looking at Rome here, right? Rome is kind of in its streets and its corridors and how it kind of operates. And there was a person named Colin Rowe who developed the Noli plan. Are you guys familiar with the Noli plan? The Noli plan really was this piece where, it's a diagram that shows like where the public can circulate around the city versus just the streets, right? Can you enter a church? Can you enter alleyways? Can you enter certain areas that are public versus private? This is kind of a new way of thinking that came out early in the years, right? So you see how Rome, when you look at it in terms of what is public, what is private, it looks very different in terms of how you look at it in terms of street access and the other way that the map kind of looked. So they said, okay, so what the Noli plan really did, right, is that they took one way that the public travels and can travel. Can we make different diagrams based off of this, right? Can we make diagrams in terms of where automobiles circulate? Can we make diagrams on how things kind of work, right? Because the Noli plan really kind of worked on how the public can kind of access things at an urban kind of core, right? We see how developments have kind of operated off of this and kind of happened over the years, right? So we're looking at some of the more famous diagrams that came out of learning from Las Vegas based off the Noli plan, right? So we see landmarks, right, that are accessible by person or car or whatever, right? The landmarks are really kind of important, right? You got fountains, you got all these other kind of things that kind of occur. We've got the parking lots, right? Parking lots are super important, right? It's the major mode of transportation that kind of occurs. And then we see a confluence of both of them being kind of connected. So to us, it's just, so then we're like, whoa, like the scale is massive, right? It's just like how we saw Paris, right, with Versailles, where all the cuts happen in housingization. We see lots of symbols in terms of Broadacre City, right? The Villa Renew. And then we've got the highway interchange in the strip of the Evergate, right? So like this is what they developed based off of those thoughts, off the Noli plan. This is what they diagrammed. They saw that there was lots of signage, lots of ducts, and things that kind of work to get your attention from the automobile. And once you're out of the automobile in a sea of parking lots, how is your attention kept? It's translated into landmarks, signs, and then to eventually you get to the destination where you spend your money. So they looked at all sorts of things, right? How things are, some of the regular neighborhoods like ranch houses, megastructures, green signs. They looked at all sorts of stuff, right? Where are the churches? Where are the ceremonial spaces? Where are all these things, right? They looked at how typical cities had developed, right? Typical cities like the trees, right? You got shaded areas where you can walk, where you can circulate, how things kind of occur. But Las Vegas does not operate that way because you need everything seen, so you see the signs and you see basically all the spectacle that kind of occurs. And this happens, like the size of them occur at the speed at which cars go, people go, and and et cetera. So this is what Las Vegas loves, is what they were saying. And there's kind of different flavors, right? So we see these awesome diagrams that they did, right? With messages that occur at the pedestrian level, right? Like there's so many, and there's basically signage that happens at the car speed level. Yeah, these diagrams are just kind of amazing. Okay, so where are we? Okay, here we go. Okay, so they classify these signs, these things, right, that grab your attention. They come here into three basic major things, right? The heraldic, the dominating signs, right? Flamingo, all these, the gas station, right, where you pay all your things, right? And then the physiognomic, right, what you see here, where they emulate features from the past, right? They're playing on your nostalgia. They're playing on, on that kind of on that sense that you'll come and you're attracted to because something is semi-familiar. You want to know more about it, and they're counting on you coming to visit it through that signage. And the Luxor was one of those very, 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 very successful physiognomic features. And then the third one is the signs attached to the building, the decorated shed. That are really more popular with right, another physiognomic one, Excalibur. And so the signs are really more what you see on Fremont Street. That's kind of what I'm getting at. So Aaron Betsky, due to Kim Gibb lecture, wrote on what these icons mean, right? Like what are icons? Like what are ways that people kind of see familiarity, right? Like from the design of a toaster to the design of a building. Why do we think about these objects, their curves, their rigid forms? Why do we design that method? What is it about those physiognomic features that are just enough to really kind of entice these feelings of nostalgia? And just recognizing, one, the idea, and then two, the object. This is another really good example of a duck, right? We see with the Excalibur, right? We're treating the feudal way of, kind of how things were done, right? Knights and kings and whatever. And then now we see the buildings that we do throw most of our capital, most of our income into as a society, into expensive big buildings, real estate, buildings that sit idle. These buildings were very much intentionally set to be that, right? Mimic a city in which these, that mimic a lot of things that you see the buildings here where like the Beer Tower represents a lot of the buildings that you see in New York that sit vacant in terms of collecting real estate for the super rich. And you see the Mandarin Oriental that's kind of operating the same way. And then you also see, the way that the shops kind of come together to really kind of bring you down from the street and entice you to walk through this artificial cityscape. So we see basically the example of signs attached to a building, the decorated sheds. Something that developed a little bit more organically over time. So this book, Complexity and Contradiction, was published in 1966. It caused a lot of stir, and it was very much like a very polemic kind of essay against a lot of the modernism, a lot of the modern work happening at the time. It was very much an argument against a lot of the 5 points in architecture that Corbusier established, and a lot of other things that kind of occurred because of modernism's kind of waking, right? Nice and et cetera, like all these other kind of ways of looking at architecture. Does anyone remember the 5 points in architecture? Anyone? Have you guys gone over Corbusier yet? In Janet White's? You have? You guys don't remember the 5 points?
I don't think we would know
it. Roof garden, guillotine. Guillotine's a column, but it's an undecorated column. That's what we see in parking garages now. So we got the guillotine, the free ground plan. We've got the free facade, and we've got the horizontal windows and the roof garden. So it's just what they were saying is that why do architects only fixate on their own kind of internal arguments as a profession? we're creating complexity that only relates to us, right? Why did Corbusier build this complexity where he said, you have a free facade, right? You can place the windows anywhere you want, right? Because it's no longer integral, it's no longer load bearing, but then you put a restriction on one of the 5 points saying that you need horizontal windows. It's just like, why are we building these basically these incompetent contradictions here? These incompetent contradictions, right? And he expands on this, right? In the third part of the book, in Learning from Las Vegas. So it just that's kind of what they're kind of that's kind of like the bigger part that the bigger argument that he sets, right? This is the book, right? Towards a new architecture. This is just like, why are we following this stuff? Like, why are we doing this? Or we're entering a different kind of situation now. This is Villa de Ava by Oné, right? From Koolhaas. This is, a perfect example of how we play and kind of continue working those languages of modernism. We see the free floating design, right? Free facade, horizontal windows, columns that allow for a free floor plan, right? The pilotis, and we also see so this is really a good example of the free floor plan, right? The kitchen has an organic shape set within columns and a free facade of windows that kind of line it. It's actually a really, really wonderful building, or not building, home. It's actually one of my favorites. Yeah, this is a really awesome shot. It's a roof garden, right? It's just a semi-commentary on, it's a commentary on kind of like, why are we following these rules, right? He kind of made light of these rules, and kind of said yes to all of it, and had fun with it. So like, what's complexity according to Venturi Scott Brown? It's this, right? They're after the circumstantial distortions. They're after the eventful exceptions, right? But they find meanings within other things, right? Things and things, where things don't make sense, right? They're after generating good and bad space. They're after, generating inclusion, inconsistency, and even, accommodate several other different features that kind of contradict each other, building complexities, right? This is this house is like one of my favorite houses too. So this is where we see, right? Like the arch isn't used in the structural capacity that we see in the. It was like when this house came out, it was just like, oh my God, what are you doing? But this is like what you see in everyday strip malls now, right? So the arch is used for a certain way that doesn't make sense, right? The keystone that holds the whole structure together, right? And right, if you move the keystone, everything kind of falls apart. The whole thing is missing. Like it doesn't make sense. Like what do you like? So it's just like this is the argument. It's like why don't we build? If we're gonna do this, like if we're gonna do these complexities and contradictions, why not take it seriously? Why not do something that's that kind of gets architecture recognized in a different kind of way? The fireplace is a very different proportion, according to Semper's 4 points of architecture, right? Are you guys familiar with Semper? Janet White's? Not yet? I think you might encounter it in the third class. But when we look at this floor plan, we begin to see a lot of strange things happen. So on the first floor, kind of enter through the vestibule. You think you're going around the fireplace, you're going around the staircase. The staircase is kind of fighting with the fireplace. The kitchen is kind of semi-cut off, and all its cabinetry is cut off to make room for the dining room. And then, all these spaces just kind of begin to not make sense in the way that you would traditionally think about them. It's just like, why are we intersecting the staircase as a mass into the fireplace when we think about, in the modernist way, the staircase is really kind of the free-floating, celebrated kind of way of like looking at architecture, right? Like Corbusier kind of like, you know, the old-known staircase and all these things, right? The ceremonial stair, but then now it's interrupted formally by fireplace, right? The importance of the staircase and its grandness is taken away now. You see how you got to squeeze through this house, right? Like this is mom's house. This is mom's house. I don't know if she liked it. I don't know, but this is wild. We see the keystone, and we see windows, and we see transparency all the way through, where we should expect something solid, like the keystone, you know. So when we look at this facade again, let me go back. When we look at this facade again, we really can tell now, right? Like it's detached, just like Corbusier kind of talked about, right? Like it's not structural, it's not integral, it's not really doing anything. What it's doing is that it's holding a lot of meaning, a lot of meaning in terms of architecture and what this meant for his mom, right? The courtyard that she wanted to live, the courtyard she wanted in front of her house, and all this kind of stuff. The windows breaking all sorts of proportions, all this stuff. This house, right? Like now we know that this facade is a veil, right? It's a simple veil applied to a box, right? That's all this thing is. So then, if you were to remove the veil, then it could become something else altogether. And that's really kind of what he was talking about: applied decoration, applied meaning, or I mean, they were, right? So now we've got. This kind of begins to make sense now, right? The duck, the decorated shed, right? So then what Venturi and Scott Brown were interested in their practice was, well, how do we make good ducks? How do we make really good sheds that can translate meaning and that become more part of the urban fabric? We're halfway there, promise. So we see the duck, right? The Coffin Manor, right? I don't think I need to go too much into detail about this, right? Because we kind of understand this. And then we've got the Guild House, which is, you know, where a lot of the complexity and contradiction comes in, right? The column, right? We got a column, but it's oversized. It doesn't need to be that size. It takes all the importance away from the entry of the building, right? An oversized column, you got to walk around to the main entrance. You kill the whole portico. Like, why is that, right? You know, you've got the arc that really is not even load bearing. You've got the windows that indicate suburban, sills in suburbia. All these things kind of come together. So when we look at this list again, right? The Guild House. What's a Guild House, guys? What's this list here?
Guild House?
Yeah.
It's a shed, right?
It's a shed. And then the Coffin Manor?
Yeah.
There we go. So, all these things, right? The Guild House contains all these things, right? It's ordinary, it's inconsistent, it's got applied ornament, it's got symbolism. The Coffin Manor, right? It's got abstraction, it's got high art, it's got, it's heroic, right? It's got advanced technology and all these things, right? That are set for a very kind of exclusive few. So this is the case, right? Where he's beginning to speculate, right? We know what the duck, we know what the shed is, we know where we kind of live now. But he's saying, right? Before the Beaux-Arts school came about, we were doing this, right? We were doing this for centuries. You can follow it all the way down to Egypt, right? Even into Mesopotamia. We were including signage, right? We were including non-structural, non-integral things, right? This is all applied decoration to show the values of their society and how things really come together as a facade, right? And so it's just like, why are we abandoning these principles? Why don't we use these wisely, right? So then he introduces this as a good duck, right? This is a really good duck because we do see the front facade, right? Shows that it's a Gothic cathedral, right? It's flowing, Christianity, whatever. And then you see that the cross and plan for the Sharks Cathedral is also a cross, acts as a duck, but then when it's extruded, it becomes a shed and contains all the functions without interrupting, and it actually accentuates the architecture through its extrusion and through its decoration and ornamentation. So, good duck, right? So this is kind of where you kind of got to rely on this meaning, right? Duck in the shed, right? So urban sprawl. Can anyone take a good guess on what this one is? Which one does this one expand upon? Does it expand upon the duck? Shed, right? And you see the megastructures operating on the duck mentality, the way that things kind of had occurred. So urban sprawl, right? We see the symbols in space, mixed media. We see pop culture come about, broad acre city, things that architects don't like, right? Right? It's ambiguous, right? Look for markets and exist year's problems, and heterogeneous, right? Does anyone know what that word means? Heterogeneous. It's one of these words that come about in architecture all the time. So I'll explain it. Heterogeneous comes from the other. In architecture, it's explaining the opposite, right? Homogeneous, right? You think when you think in chemistry and everything, right? Like a homogeneous mixture is this big blob, right? It's this one contained thing, right? So buildings and architecture are the same thing. When we talk about megastructures, we say that they're homogeneous, right? Like we don't treasure the heterogeneous, which is very much fragmented buildings, fragmented program, scattered across the landscape, because it doesn't hold the big vision of what the architect proposes. You don't have the money shot, right? You don't have the easy digestible image that architects like, and then that consultants also kind of speculate, right? So you see. So you see that, it's got the correct lifestyle. This is the way you should live, right? The modern style, the instant city, right? The Ville Verdu. Like all this thing kind of operates off that thinking, right? The easy image, the easy whole, right? We got the megastructure, and how that all kind of comes together, right? This building is massive. Right? Resorts World. Just like, why did we have to build such a massive thing when it doesn't make sense programmatically? But it's all in for the big image and how it can be digested across the whole entire city. It's more so about how you can see this thing when you're coming into town from LA and how you're coming into town from Salt Lake City, right? It takes 3 hotel companies to manage all these hotel rooms. Right? Like this is a city. Like this thing is massive, right? So like, why didn't we fragment these things and find ways to scatter this thing across the landscape? But it's all about the big image and what these consultants are doing, right? Like, why are we continuing everything? Why are we forcing pedestrians to go this way? We want them to get lost in this big maze and spend all their money, right? We entice them enough with this big, modern, clean image. You come in here and you basically spend your money, was what their arguments are. And then they move into the contrast, right? Something that develops over time. You see a lot more what happened in downtown Las Vegas. I guess that is. What we see here with downtown, where we have a series of sheds that were once pharmacies, that were once these drugstores, the ones were grocery stores, that get converted into all these sorts of casinos, right? Golden Nugget, this whole front facade here, used to be a pharmacy designed by Sigmund Sharp. They were one of the earlier architecture firms. Right? Like this is kind of how an urban plan happens throughout time, and what it kind of becomes, right? Like all these players plug into a non-cohesive whole, right? Like there isn't that grand image, right? The square footage here is less within these two urban blocks than the square footage you got in Resorts World, right? It's kind of terrifying when you think about these things in that size. And they were talking about this back in the 60s and 70s. You know, when we come up with massive megastructures that can't be reused anymore, right? We use a lot of embodied energy to tear these down, to even construct these, because they no longer have a purpose, right? There isn't a piece that we can save, a portion that we can save in the urban fabric to reuse for another kind of thing, right? But we were able to reuse and readapt a lot of the strip. I mean, a lot of the downtown area, right? These are the megastructures that he's talking about. All these housing projects. Habitat 67 by Manshi Safdie that we see here. Okay, where am I? I just want to make sure that I'm not talking too much. So now we see, right? So now we see like this. So now we see like their stance, right? Their position. Oops, I went too far. There we go. So this is one of the earlier projects that got known, right? It's the beach house. This is where that last portion of the book comes together. Where we're talking about the theory of the ugly and the contradictory. You know, their main argument is saying that a building should not be a vehicle for an architect's ideas. It's just, you know, an architecture can be ordinary, rather conventional in how it's constructed and how it's seen in its process and symbolism. Right? And I'm taking this out of page 129. It says, to construct conventionally is to use ordinary materials and engineering, except in the present and usually organization of the building industry and its financial structure, hoping to ensure vast and sound economic construction, right? So like this means that like, okay, we've got a construction industry, we've got, you know, clients that we're responsible for as architects. Why are we spending so much money on lavish things like beton roofs, concrete? Why are we spending so much money on these things? We've got things to fulfill, right? Like why aren't we putting our intellect towards things of the everyday, ordinary, right? Why aren't we taking these things that are known for builders and how they do things, like simple wood cladding, you know, and how do we use this differently in a different way, right? Unconventional use that stands out as signage, right? It's just that we see how they give prominence to the home here, through where they elevated the first floor half level, so you're entering a house that's, you know, elevated a certain amount of feet. Only those who belong here can enter, but then they offset it, right? They offset the proportions, right? Like this happens usually in churches, right? And civic structures where we see the elevated footsteps, but it's being used for a home here as a relief. But it's not centered. It's you know, it's it's asymmetrical, right? And we see the signage to the number 9, so then we know that you've arrived to the place where you're supposed to be, right? All the windows, right? Like conventional window systems, used in really kind of unique ways here. So this is another fire station, right? Where they clearly call out, you know, that one, it's a fire station with its tower, 2, the center door that's going on here. But then you offset the proportions, right? Look at the way that the red stripe hits the window in the center proportions and how much it's offset the floor. Right? Like these are really kind of weird things that haven't existed in fire stations for so long when we think about them, right? When we do one big opening, thinking that it's going to be just the garage door, they're throwing the storage door in here, right? Like this is just like, gosh, guys, like this is all kind of new stuff, right? So there's another book you got to be familiar about. Venturi was another one that came from that period with the New York Five. There was this big discussion, right? Architects talking intellectual things around a circle, and maybe you want to kill yourself because it's all architectural theory and philosophy. I don't know, right? But the reason why this book was important was because he's saying, right, that, and this came around the same time period, right? He's saying that, I'm just gonna like quickly semi-summarize it up, right? This kind of comes from Marxist theory, I'm sure if you or whatever, but the whole thing is that this also influenced the work, and what's coming from it is that architects have taken responsibility out of the work that they're doing nowadays, right? We're not focusing on, right, the latest theory that's influencing things is towards a new architecture by like Corbusier, but you don't see issues like social issues, income, new ways of technology kind of being done and developed. You don't see how architects are taking responsibility in terms of being the architect developer, right? You don't see them doing urban planning anymore, right? Architects have given away so much responsibility away, right? Urban planning used to be what the architect used to do as well, right? Now it's a separate practice, right? Architects no longer take responsibility in terms of any liabilities, right? They're only responsible for in X, Y, and Z, right? Like they don't have skin in the game, right? Like they're hired as consultants to design these buildings for people that don't know how buildings come together, right? Like they're not percentage of owners in you know these kind of industries anymore. So architects have become basically like these kind of have become basically like this glorified kind of proletariat, right? Like we're workers. We're not defining anything anymore. That we've kind of become stagnant because we've limited our liability and responsibility for what we're doing now through area contracts and all these things that are designed to minimize our responsibility and liability. So it's kind of largely affected what we're doing, right? And all these things, right? Just because we're talking about all these things, we have things like Rural Studio developed, right? Work that does for low communities. We have design build. We have all these things that spur out of this postmodern period that architects are so inspired by this, right? Like, why are we listening to things that architects never care, right? Why are we listening to Peter Izenour talk about how we're using several different permutations to generate grids, and those intersectional grids and rotations affect another volumetric permutation, and somehow you end up with like this really kind of sad home, for example, house 4, house 5, that really is disconnected from the environment and all these kind of things. So that's kind of really what this book was critiquing. So we see is that we also see that there is decoration that happens in terms of this last kind of speculations that, whoa, like decoration is happening here, right? We've got contradictions going on. You've got, structural columns, but they're covered for fireproofing, and then we got to tack on another expensive column here that is, that has so much embodied energy here, but for what, right? Like, what are we representing, right? What are we doing? Like, why are we doing this? Like, it's still applied decoration, so then why are we taking these people seriously? Right? Is that we're left with an ideology that that architects, one, are like these idealists that design these structures, but then are just like, okay, we'll do it for whoever gives us a comfortable lifestyle, right? We'll do it for rich people. We'll do it for whatever, right? We're going to use our intellect for this, right? Right? Where we come to a really kind of pristine location in Illinois, build this thing where it doesn't, when it heats up, right? You're building a contradiction here, where you've got to have the mechanical system on all the time when the weather's super nice because of all this glaziness exposed. You elevate the platform away from nature, but then you want to commodify nature by having all these open windows that you can look at, right? It's like it's capitalism is like operating on this kind of crazy end, right? That Venturi and Teferi are kind of talking about. That it's like we commodify even the views. We commodify the air that we breathe in these buildings, right? It's just today's a really nice day outside. We could just open this window, right? But we can't. These are the contradictions that they speak about. So then we see these kind of ideas, right? That spur out. This is a building that was done in the early 2000s. Anyone familiar with Marlon Blackwell? Anyone? Nobody? So he's an architect that's based in the Ozarks. And he does a lot of work for low-income communities, right? This structure was built for, I think, $120 a square foot back when things were getting done for at least $230 a square foot. Like, this is like using, like, the everyday, right? You got corrugated metal, right? Like, this is stuff used for, like, sheds everywhere, all right? But then it's an application of how we use symbols, the way that we use, how we unconventionally use things that, entry, how we use even just simple film to introduce different ways of light, right? It's very much a smart duck, right? But when we look at its floor plan, we see that it's got very much the same things, right? We've got the sense of procession that you're entering a different kind of proportion. You enter a vestibule, then you also see the main church, right? And then it opens up and its proportions completely change in these doors that then make it a community center, right? Like, it serves different functions for different people just through who we spend our time designing for, right? Is that, it's like the funny story that comes about this building is that this was a satellite dish that was chilling for like a large satellite dish that was in someone's backyard. They threw it in here, put it around a whole bunch of metal studs, and just cladded the whole thing, in plaster. Right now they got a dome that represents, a lot of the things that we wanted in terms of whatever that represented Catholicism and whatnot. Right, like this altar. Right, this actually came from Crown Royal advertisement from a liquor store. Like, these things are kind of like wild, right? It's just kind of like, where are you going to take things? How are you going to be clever about these things? And how do you kind of build for communities and kind of et cetera? It's just right. It's just that we can, just using a very simple kind of metal structure, we can begin to play with soffits and things like that and reliefs to begin to generate those these kind of wonderful spaces that we want, right? We see this building in New Orleans, this plaza in New Orleans. It's called Plaza d'Italia by Michael Graves, right? And it's postmodern glory, but it's bringing that connection in which you have New Orleans that developed from Italian, mainly French influences, and how things really kind of come and generate a melting pot around New Orleans, right? It ties into like these kind of bigger meanings, attached meanings, etc. Right? It's just this is anybody know what this building is? So this is an office building in LA. Anyone know the architect? You guys probably have heard of him.
Frank Gehry.
Frank Gehry. So it's just don't be afraid. It's about taking different positions, right? What Frank Gehry is doing completely different than this, right? It's just like, don't be afraid to explore these ideas, and kind of things that you have in school. Even when you're in school or out of school, it's just, like we've got to generate these things, right? These buildings that one attach themselves to the cultural influence and to kind of help society and things, right? It's just if this was another generic lawyer office building, this thing would have gotten tore down forever ago, and so much embodied energy would have been gone away. But all it is a simple decorated shed. I mean, it's a sign, right, attached to a generic building. That's all this thing is, right? It's the elevator to the building, right? It's a sign that you see from the street. It's a detached sign. This is a smart duck, right? This is one of OMA's newest projects. It's the same project that I showed you guys with Villa Dava. Playing on the same ideas here, right? We got a museum for rocks and what is it? It's geology. And they put the main circulation, the main stratification with all this glass that's meant to represent, these images of rocks and crystallizations, right? The facade and the way that it's broken down, right? To show that there's stratification in rocks and all this kind of stuff. Right? Like it's a smart duck. This is a house. Doesn't even look like a house, right? That really kind of exemplifies a lot of passive modern techniques, right? This is a house that's used by playing studio, right? They got a detached Corten steel shed, right? That takes the majority of the heat, and then they put the courtyard, all the interior courtyards opening north, right? They use the enclosure on the west, right, to generate shed, the uncontrollable sunlight. And they took very much seriously the idea of the veil, right? But then their idea is we're using sustainability, right? Sustainability is the veil here. There's ways to do it. So when you see this thing again, kind of think about like the social aspects that it's lacking. Think about the issues that it's not addressing, and then think about the people who actually worship these things, like Philip Johnson, right? And kind of move from the international style. And then this kind of brings you to the next point, right? It's really kind of detached from everything. But let me see where I put that note. Right. So SciArc is really kind of this. Anyone familiar with SciArc? So SciArc is really like this school that was formed by in Southern California. The big schools that existed back then were UCLA, USC, and I forgot the other one. I think it was one of the city colleges. SciArc really kind of became known, where it's a school for the avant-garde architects training the avant-garde. The school really was established by 5 architects. Eric Moss, Tommy, I think it's Zellner, and the other 2 I can't remember. Anyways, the school kind of embodied the same attitude, right? Questioning the status quo. Where is it going? Why is how are things kind of going, right? Really kind of continuously questioning the things that are kind of being shoved down our throats in school. It just what I'd kind of take away from this is just to me is just so what SciArc's going through right now is that the school have this kind of talk where they talked about what you're supposed to do once you hit the workplace, right? If you want to work for a top design firm, expect long hours, little to no compensation. Expect that your professor is the one that kind of like yells at you, and if you don't, pay attention to it or whatever, right? Like you're supposed to follow the status quo here, right? You're supposed to be treated poorly because it reflects upon what your reference is going to be, right? Who to use as a reference, obviously your professor, etc., right? These students were like, they were just like, no, like this shit is super tone deaf. Like we don't want to do it. We have no part of it. Like we've got recorded emails about how we're treated poorly by faculty, etc. We're the avant-garde school. Like let's live up to it. And just like that's kind of like what they're saying, right? Like professors, shouldn't be, leaving students in the dark about several things, abusing their position of power. To me, is just kind of remember that, your students, right? And you guys have rights about how things are kind of ran here. You guys can, do whatever you want and how things go. But it's just, to me, this is something that like it's not okay to take a low-paying job for like a reference or for whatever, right? Like I've gone through it, and I was talking to. It's just the only reason I brought it up is because I stayed here in the studio the other day, and I'm like, geez, like I've been doing this for 10 years now, and like I'm kind of like like things really kind of haven't changed in some ways. or kind of have gone worse, just like a lot of reasons is why, like, it's kind of like my last semester teaching for a while. But yeah, that's SciArc, but yeah, it's just, you could have the 9-to-5 job. You could have, the family that you want, right? Like all these things, like architecture is also not a low-paying job, right? Like if you want to do the meaningful work, these kind of social structures kind of exist that kind of prohibit that. But go through, go work for some places while you're young and do it, and kind of explore it if architecture is your thing. But to me, it's kind of like it puts a lot of things into perspective, introducing such a heavy theory book like Learning from Las Vegas, because it's too much about class, too much about social structures. So, with that, any questions? Was it too much? I don't know. Any question? Are the bigger concepts clear? Complexity makes sense now? Contradiction makes sense now? Sheds? Speculation on megastructures? Urban sprawl? Just, it's like big ideas, right? How do they tie together to the bigger thing? We're relying on too many other things to kind of piece this thing together, right? So, I hope this helped.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.